Judge Joseph Goff Jr. was appointed Associate Circuit Judge for St. Francis County by Governor Jay Nixon in 2015. Following his appointment, he was elected in 2016 and 2018. He is currently serving a 4-year term that expires in 2022. Prior to his appointment, he was an assistant prosecuting attorney in the St. Francis County Prosecutor's Office. He also served as an assistant attorney general for the Missouri Attorney General's Office in Jefferson City and as an associate at Reeves and Goff PC in Farmington, Missouri. Judge Goff received his college degree from Southeast Missouri State University and his law degree from St. Louis University. He is a 2004 graduate of Farmington High School.
Thank you all, and I want to apologize as probably being the third most qualified person on that panel over there to talk about the law, because we have from the DEA agent lawyer, and then we also have Robert over there who was a co-author on the bill. He's going to talk to you later. I don't want to steal any of his thunder, but he and I had a really interesting talk about the Good Samaritan law before I came up here to talk about this, so I might steal some of what he gave me in that presentation. The first part to talk about is going to be section 2. I didn't skip a slide, nor did Amber mess up in changing the slide. Section 2 of this bill that was went into effect, as you saw, August of 2017, is where you see what you would consider the meat of the law. In that section, it says what actually the Good Samaritan 911 law does. And I'm going to call it the Good Samaritan 911 law, or I'm going to try, because we also have a Good Samaritan law, which I was confused about when I looked this up. There's a Good Samaritan law that says if you're a medical professional and you provide aid to somebody who needs it on the street, you may or may not be held liable for some of that legal stuff that could come out of that situation. So this is the Good Samaritan 911 law. It was intended, and I believe if you read section 2 behind me, you will see, to protect folks from criminal prosecution who call 911 because of a medical emergency or a drug or alcohol overdose. So what does it protect from and how does it protect you? But if you read the law there, I highlighted or I bolded the most important parts, but we're talking about people who seek or obtain medical assistance for someone who's experiencing drug or alcohol overdose. But then we also have the person who is the subject of the request for emergency assistance, medical assistance, that is the person who is overdosing themselves. And I take it, if we were to ask Robert, there are specific instances that cover each one of these scenarios, both the person calling for help, and the person who is receiving the medical assistance in the past having been charged with crimes. Now, as we go on in the slideshow here, it says you shall not be arrested, charged, prosecuted, or convicted for the following. So it's not every crime, and I feel like that's important here to talk about, because it's not all crimes, it's not distribution, it is not endangering the welfare of a child, it is possession of a controlled substance, possession of drug paraphernalia, and possession of an imitation controlled substance. There's also public nuisance, and then we have some alcohol sections on there as well. Sale of alcohol to a minor, minor with the fake ID. I don't think I have music on my slides, did I? The interesting thing when I look this up is, obviously we are here at the Opioid Consortium to talk about drug abuse, overdoses, and prevention of overdose deaths. However, when I was looking up the 911 drug law, it was interesting to me because we have several college towns here in the state of Missouri, and their focus in their newspapers was on the alcohol overdose and medical emergencies that arise out of alcohol abuse. So obviously that was covered, and I'm sure Robert, when he co-authored this, was thinking of those college towns where you do hear about those instances where somebody overdoses or drinks too much alcohol, especially college students in the atmosphere. At the bottom, there's two important things. There's violating a restraining order and violating probation or parole. Those are two very big things. And if you look at this list of what we are saying, someone shall not be arrested, prosecuted, charged, convicted, what you think about is removing the fear in that moment when someone starts to overdose, when two friends are together, or when somebody recognizes a person who is going into overdose. I believe the environment was such at the time when before this bill went into effect, that the fear of prosecution, the fear of the legal repercussions of calling for help was greater than the need to save the life, or than the concern for the person who was overdosing. And it was in those instances, in that moment of fear, where you had that fight or flight. And in that instance, it was call help or run, and a lot of people chose run. There were several anecdotes that I looked at, people that went to Jeff City and testified. This was Senate Bill 501 that was passed. And one of them was a lady whose son had been unconscious in his friend's basement for 17 hours before anybody called for any help. And the other one was a lady who, I believe it was her daughter, who was unconscious for 20 hours in a car by herself before anybody called help. Now, whether or not that was kind of the psychology of somebody's going to call help, I'm not going to call because I see a person in that car that seems to be having trouble. But I think what this bill covers is specifically those instances where the friend or the person who knows this person just did drugs, I did drugs with them, we have drugs here, I can't call 911 because I'm going to get in trouble. That's the instance where the Good Samaritan 911 law is attempting to remove perhaps that stigma of, if we call 911, we're going to be arrested. Now, it does not protect from all legal repercussions, and that's what we see on the next page. Outstanding warrants under mules. There's a law in Missouri that requires law enforcement to run a mules check when they have a stop. When crafting this law, I'm sure they were aware of the situation, which is to say if law enforcement has a contact with a person, they have to run that person through the NCIC or the mules system to see if they have a warrant. It also doesn't protect you from being charged with any other offense. So we had those inclusive offenses on there. That's all that this law protects from. That's all that you have immunity from prosecution from. It also, and this is in kind of in the legal part, the protection of prosecution under this section shall not be grounds for suppression of evidence or dismissal and charges unrelated to the section. And that gets into some legal back and forth that you would see in court. But in reading these parts, what I see, and what I ran this by Robert, so he blessed all of this before I came up here to talk. But Robert told me, this is what I said, I think in looking at the 911 law, it is a shield for those that in good faith are attempting to get medical help for a person who is overdosing and needs it. It is not a sword. It is not something, and the example I used was, if two people are using and they're afraid they're going to get in trouble, you can't go drag somebody into the room and then call 911 and be free from prosecution. That would be the sword use of this law, and that's not what it's intended. And as we get into the definitions, which is on the next slide here, talking about drug or alcohol overdose. Now we're getting back to Section 1. Section 1's definitions, which is why I skipped it. I wanted to get you all with the exciting stuff first. Judging by your reaction, I might have messed up on my ordering of the slides here. But they specifically defined a drug or alcohol overdose. And the reason is, as I said, they want to cover the situation. And if you remember from Section 2, it's a good faith request. And that good faith request is what you're going to look at if it was a judge, if it was a prosecutor, a law enforcement officer, as to whether or not this person was legitimately seeking medical attention for somebody who was suffering an overdose, or if this was perhaps not a good faith situation where simply the person was attempting to evade prosecution for what was otherwise a crime. They define drug or alcohol overdose specifically, and we can go through all of these, but essentially it covers what we just talked about with the Narcan. When you're going to need to, it's recognizing somebody's overdosing, those symptoms are covered in here such that if you call for help 911, it is not something that you're going to be prosecuted for any of those listed crimes. Again, like I said, it's not all crimes, it's the listed crimes. On the next slide, we talk about medical assistance. And this includes reporting a drug or alcohol overdose, being the one who calls 911, assisting someone who is reporting, or providing care to someone who is experiencing a drug or alcohol overdose or other medical emergency. Now, the other medical emergency I think is pertinent here. However, it maybe is not something that is as relevant for this discussion tonight. I think it's important to talk about, though, because they weren't focusing solely on the drug abuse or the alcohol abuse, but this is any medical emergency. And as I said, I think the intention is in the moment to remove that initial fear when somebody realizes a situation is going bad, that they can call 911 without necessarily worrying about those legal repercussions that you would have from any of those laws. And those are substantial, because I know in terms of probation or violating parole, those are very serious considerations for an individual. And I believe when the legislator passed this law, I don't know this for a fact, but they were looking at increasing the value of human life over necessarily legal consequences. And in balancing that act, you have to look at that. And so to tell you how this law is going to be is going to affect the courts in Missouri, prosecution in Missouri, criminal justice in our state, I can't tell you, but the law is always a balancing act. And so in order to maybe speak a little bit about commentary in terms of how this law affects our lives, I would say looking to any court, to any prosecutor, agent, lawyer, or people that just call themselves lawyers around here, it is always about that balancing act of the good faith request for help. Now, there is a wide berth in there, and in the state as it's being implemented now, I can't necessarily say for sure how it's going to be enforced or even reassure people as to how it would be enforced if in a particular situation, if somebody in here right now tonight calls 911 for help because somebody may be experiencing a drug overdose, it's a different situation that's going to be interpreted differently. However, thanks to Robert and the folks that drafted this bill, they drafted it specifically enough that I feel like they can give the reassurance to individuals who may be in a position to call 911 when somebody is experiencing a drug overdose, to not worry necessarily about the consequences immediately, but to focus on the human life. So we don't have the teenager in a basement for 17 hours or the young lady in a car for 20 hours who is experiencing an overdose and is well beyond any help. Because again, as we just heard, Narcan is an incredibly simple drug to administer, and it's incredibly effective. The longer we wait, the more we try to worry about covering up what's happened, the further away we are getting, or we are pushing that person from their possibility of holding on to their life in those moments. The last section of this law is one that I've not had a lot of familiarity with. I read it, it's in the law. I don't necessarily know, and I can't really speak to how it is being forced, but I think it's relevant in talking tonight, as Agent Lawyer talked about, the importance, and I think as we see this as a country dealing with opioid abuse and overdose, education is going to be critical. And empowering in this law enforcement, the ones who perhaps at one point, folks who would be in a situation to call 911 would be afraid to see, would be afraid to have them come up. Now, possibly we can make them ambassadors of drug help, because as a population, that's who they're going to interact with most, is law enforcement. And empowering law enforcement, maybe taking away the stigma of sharing information for drug help, is going to go along with that education that's going to be necessary if we truly are going to have any hope in terms of actually understanding opioid overdoses and getting help to the people that need it. And as I said, and as Robert and I talked about before, we may all have had come to our mind a situation where we think of 911, and we may be thinking of that dark cellar or that lonely car in the middle of the night in the Walmart parking lot where people are using. However, those aren't necessarily the folks that encompass 192 overdose deaths a day in the United States. Those statistics are made up of two teenagers who, one of them whom has a legitimate prescription for an opioid, and they give it to their friend and their friend starts having trouble, or who get into their mom's medicine cabinet, and because in that moment they're afraid to call 911 because all they know is they maybe did something bad and they might get in trouble. Those are the lives that we're losing as well. It's not maybe your worst case scenario, the stereotypical, in your mind, what you're thinking of, an overdose and somebody in a dark, forgotten cellar who their family hasn't checked in on in years. These are people, these are children that all of us have and that all of us care about in the community that are losing their lives to overdose. And I think, and as Robert will say, this bill was passed in a lot of ways out of frustration, out of those critical moments that were lost when someone was sitting there pondering the legal consequences of calling 911 instead of just calling 911 and getting the individual the help they needed. It's a very brief overview of the law. I apologize for not going in depth on it. As I said, it's 2 years old. It's a balancing act when it comes to the courts and how these are being interpreted and how this law is being applied. However, I do believe already it's made a difference, and I hope as we move further along, as people become more familiar with this, we do see more 911 calls immediately, and we do see more folks who would have otherwise been left for dead brought back, or at least having the opportunity to be administered the Narcan that is so vital to these overdose situations. Thank you all very much.